Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We are going to go ahead and get started. My name is Adrienne Mahsa Varkiani. I'm a deputy editor at the New Republic, and this is Immigration Report Card. I'm joined by a panel of really amazing experts today. We have Dara Lind, at the Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council. Nayna Gupta, Policy Director at the American Immigration Council, Frimpong, Legal Director at CASA, Sarah Rich, Senior Attorney at Democracy Forward. Obviously, I know people are not just their job titles, but we are just going to drop in their bios in the chat so we can get to the conversation, which I'm really excited about. So first question is for everyone. Trump's first 6 months in office have been quite a whirlwind in immigration news. That includes the deportations, the detentions that we're seeing, Alligator Alcatraz, the travel and refugee bans, the attack on birthright citizenship, the attacks on students. I could go on for quite some time, and I'm not going to. But a lot of times, immigrants' rights are viewed as this kind of separate category, and it's easy to look at a lot of the horrors that we see unfolding before us and say, well, these people aren't American, this won't affect me. And I know that no one here thinks that, but I was hoping that you could give our viewers a quick explanation of why that's not actually the case and why a lot of the horrors that we have seen unfolding actually affect and undermine democracy for everyone. Dara, do you want to kick us off since I know AIC has a report out about this today?
Sure. Thank you so much to Adrienne and to TNR for having this discussion, and to my absolute rock star panelists, including my long-suffering co-author. So I think that, there are a lot of ways to answer this question, right? And one of them is, what is this doing to US citizens? Like, you can say that immigrants themselves, okay, they don't have a full claim to being American, but even if you grant that, US citizens who show support for immigrants, who want to, provide welcoming communities, that's becoming so much harder to do, whether that's, arrests of people for doing accompaniments at an immigration court, whether that's nonprofit organizations that are seeing their grants slashed, that are being, harassed in some cases by including the Vice President of the United States, saying that they just care about money, and are trying to undermine Americans. It's going after a kind of speech, a kind of political belief, because it ends up standing up for people who this administration feels not only shouldn't be part of the conversation, but no one should be able to stand up on their behalf.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to share. I also think it's very important to remember, right, that, the government might be talking about immigrants today, right? Who will they be talking about tomorrow, right? It is much harder to defeat us, the people, when we are divided, right? When we can't put up a united front. And so othering different segments within our community, of course, makes it a lot harder to then go after the othered, get rid of them, and then once we get rid of them, who is next, right? And so I'm always, for me as a Black African immigrant woman, right, who is now a naturalized citizen of the United States, right? I sit in a very unique intersection, right? Where I'm always trying to drive the message home to my US born Black identifying folks, right? Of like, this is all of us, right? This was once us, and this will be us again tomorrow. They're not talking about immigrants, they're talking about trans folks, right? They're talking about low income folks, right? So we all need to make sure that we're providing a united front and not falling for the division tactics that make us much easier to conquer by the government.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the way that we talked about this in our report at the council is really that, this is immigrants and immigration as the tip of the spear in Trump's attack on democracy, right? This is a leader with authoritarian tendencies who wants to undermine core democratic norms across American society, to wield his power in an authoritarian way. And he's intentionally starting with immigrants because they think, given the politically divisive nature of this issue, the xenophobic narrative that they've successfully advanced, and the results of the last election, that they can get away with it. And they can start here to set a new status quo, right? When it comes to core rights, when it comes to the separation of powers between our three branches of federal government, when it comes to the delicate balance between what state governments and the federal government do. You know, we've seen them use immigration to completely disregard rights that I think most Americans understand to be universal, that we learn about in middle school civics class or in pop culture. You know, First Amendment right to free speech, as Dara alluded to, the Fourth Amendment protection against unreasonable search and seizure, but we're sweeping up people in our streets, including US citizens and those with lawful status. You know, the right to due process for everybody, but banishing people to foreign prisons in foreign countries with absolutely no fair day in court. And if you start eroding those rights now and use immigration as a tool, and as a country, we don't hold the line at this point, then to the last speaker's point, we get to a place where when they attack those rights more and more for everybody, we've lost ground already. And so in many ways, what we're seeing on immigration is, of course, about the lives and livelihoods of immigrant communities. But it really is an intentional attack on democracy, I think quite, you know, premeditated and calculated by the admin.
Yeah, I'll wrap up by agreeing with all of my co-panelists and congratulating Dara and Nayna on their report, which really does a great job of highlighting the links between attacks on immigrants, immigrant communities, people who support immigrants, and the attack on democracy. NILC, the National Immigration Law Center, had another report, I believe about a month ago, covering a very similar theme. And this is, and Democracy Forward has also been really trying to explain how central the fight for immigrants' rights is within the larger pro-democracy movement. And I really think the pro-democracy movement is getting it, and support for immigrant communities has really expanded, having seen the vicious attacks by this administration on them. And to me, I look at this as sort of, it's an authoritarian two-step, right? They start with alien enemies because that's easy, and you talk about a foreign threat and you need to protect against that foreign threat, and that justifies all kinds of power grabs. And then you move to the enemy within. And Trump consistently has talked about both non-citizens as a threat, and even like a pollution, poisoning the blood, right? And then he also talks about the enemy within, sort of in his language, right? The far left, the radical left, Marxist vermin, etc. And I think he sees those as a continuum of things that need to be, of communities that don't belong and that should be eradicated from the body politic. So I really think if we let them get away with going after alien enemies, they'll quickly go after the enemy within.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I could do an entire session just on the language he uses to talk about immigrants. I got a question about whether this is being recorded, and I just wanted to say yes, this is being recorded. It will be posted on the New Republic's YouTube channel, hopefully as soon as possible. Next question, again for everyone, since everyone here is an expert in their own respective field, and I went through some of the immigration issues in the beginning, but there is quite a broad scope of attacks right now. I'd love to know, what is the one issue in the immigration space right now that concerns you the most in terms of the attack on democracy that it poses, or the one issue that you think people are not paying enough attention to, again, in the immigration space? Anyone can kick us off.
I think I can start off, and I know we'll talk about Kilmer's case a little bit later on, but for me, particularly disturbing is just the erosion of procedural due process rights, right? Just like summarily punishing people without giving them notice, the opportunity to be heard, right? An actual decision by a neutral party. Because what we're seeing is that the administration is going to continue testing and expanding the limits of these erosions of procedural due process rights. So, you know, a lot of people, of course, right, paid attention to the individuals who were deported rapidly to El Salvador back in March. That's one example, right? We have, you know, the government stripping people of their parole protections, dismissing removal proceedings for people who are going through 240 removal proceedings, and then putting them in expedited removal and deporting them quickly. We have them now suddenly saying, you know, like individuals who, for as long as we know, have been eligible to request bond from an immigration judge, suddenly ICE is saying, no, 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 actually, these individuals are not eligible for bond, so they can't even request bond. So it's like, it's just the kind of, you know, expanding the limits, right? More and more of like what lack of procedural due process looks like. And that's very, very concerning to me, right? Because I think, you know, if you're not within the immigration space, you're not necessarily seeing these different examples, right? You're seeing the ones that make it to the news, right? But there are so many other examples of them, again, like literally being judge, jury, and executioner, deporting people to their deaths, right? Without actually giving them a chance to protect themselves, without actually giving them a chance to fight their cases in court. So that to me is a huge issue that I want to make sure that people know about and that we're shedding more light on.
Yeah, I want to highlight a couple of things that Alma mentioned. I know we're, you know, I think that this is probably a common enough thing that we'll be talking about it a little more later. But you know, what people have called delegalization, which I don't love as a term, because the problem is that immigration is it's super complicated, right? And there's this whole spectrum of levels of protection that people can have if they have some form of recognition from the government, and the gradations between what is legal status and what is lawful presence and what is, you know, deportation, what is protection from deportation that isn't either of those. That's all. It's technical. It sounds technical to US citizens, but it actually means a great deal for how many protections people have if the government decides to go after them. And so when we're talking about taking people who have temporary protected status and stripping that, or as Amma mentioned, taking people who are in immigration court proceedings who, you know, are trying to follow the law and seek some form of relief, and saying we're closing your case so that we can take a stab at deporting you without a hearing. It's none of that is in all of that is kind of taking advantage of the lesser protections that people have along various parts of the spectrum, but it's also taking advantage of the fact that Americans don't know about these gradations, that there's this assumption that people can just get legal, and there has never been, therefore, quite enough attention to the options that people have when that, you know, given that that isn't the case.
Yeah, I mean, I can jump in. I would, both of these would be on my list. I mean, I think the procedural due process is such an alarming concern when it comes to democracy. But one I'll add, I guess, is, you know, this administration is working now very closely with state and local police around the country to advance mass deportation. They are, you know, they have state and local officers doing the work of federal immigration agents in an unprecedented and aggressive manner. You know, we've seen the stories of students driving to practice who get pulled over in a traffic stop and who are all of a sudden indefinitely detained or, you know, ripped from their lives permanently. And the admin, you know, in some instances, there are state and local law enforcement agencies who've agreed to do this, but in many instances, the admin is coercing agencies into this action by threatening with withholding federal funding, by bullying and other kinds of ways to get state and local police to advance this mass deportation agenda. And what that means on the ground, and we're hearing reports of this, is that communities are less likely to trust their state and local police officers. There was a searing post from a sheriff in the Nashville area in Tennessee right after raids that happened there with state police officers doing the work of the federal government, where an immigrant caretaker was too scared to call 911 and a baby died because of what she'd seen in her community on immigration enforcement. And the Constitution does have a delicate balance here. States are responsible for policing and public safety in their own communities. And this is the Trump administration coming in and eroding that responsibility and stepping on that authority and autonomy that state and localities are supposed to have. And that's something that is hard to explain in an everyday way, but is really concerning given that we're only 6 months in here.
Yeah, there are so many individual issues within the immigration space that, if they were happening on their own 10 years ago, it would have been a 5-alarm fire, but because they're all happening at once, it can be really hard to even drill down and pay attention to any of them at any one time, right? Like the administration is trying to strip legal counsel from unaccompanied children who have to show up in immigration court. They want to send toddlers to immigration court with no lawyer. I mean, what? That's horrific and insane. And that alone is a terrible, terrible thing that could, again, be a serious emergency in other circumstances. But they are also trying to expand ICE to essentially be a national police force that operates with masks, in plain clothes, unmarked vans. And they just got billions more dollars to do that. That also is very concerning. And the creation of databases and sort of surveillance systems within the federal government to track migrants is a less covered issue, I think. It's gotten some press coverage. I don't know if it's on the front of most people's mind, but it's certainly very concerning. And we should all, people who are interested in personal liberties, and privacy should be very concerned about that, because there's no way that they'll restrain that only to non-citizens, right? You create surveillance technology, it tends to expand. And then more broadly, sort of at a meta level, like I just continue to be extremely concerned about the way that this administration is attempting to demonize people, especially Black and brown migrants, through the creation of propaganda videos that sort of revel in cruelty. This new Everglades detention facility is another example of that. The way that of course, the way the administration talks about people, the language that they use, it is all setting up sort of an ethnic cleansing, vibe, as the kids would say, wherein a lot of cruelty and violence is justified because of how they have portrayed people for years and years and years and talked about people. I think in the report, Dara and Nayna's report, the way that they call this an exercise in bending reality to match propaganda. I'll keep plugging your report because I really loved it. And I think that's important. They've come up with words and frames that they want to use to talk about immigration, and then they try to make propaganda that matches that and push people into those categories and portray them in a certain way, again, to justify violence and cruelty against them. And that's just a longer story. It's been going on for a decade, but it is obviously extremely concerning.
Thank you. Sorry for smiling throughout your answer. That's what I do when I get uncomfortable, and ethnic cleansing vibes is gonna stay with me. But yeah, this is a really good overview of some of the major issues right now in the immigration space. I was hoping to zoom in on one, which is the attack on international students specifically, that we've been seeing. Dara, I know you've written a little bit in the past about how a lot of our modern immigration laws from the Cold War era. And this seems to be what Secretary of State Marco Rubio is using to attack students in terms of removing non-citizens who are a threat to our foreign policy. So we saw that in the case of Rumeysa Ozturk, the Tufts University graduate student. We saw that in the case of Mahmoud Khalil, the Columbia University graduate and student organizer. I think we've seen that in the case of a lot of other students. I was hoping you could tell me a little bit more about whether the specific provision he's using, this like threat to foreign policy, does that have precedence over due process rights? How has this law been used in the past? Do you think there's a resurgence of it being used right now? And what are your concerns about it? Sorry, those are a million questions, but give me a brief overview.
Sure. So, I mean, I actually want to take a step back because it's not just this one provision. This administration loves, and this goes back to actually the first Trump term, right? They love finding provisions of the law that haven't been used for a long time, and therefore that there isn't really developed case law from like the 21st century on, and saying that means we can do whatever we want. Like this is, the in some cases like the Alien Enemies Act or the Title 42, the law they use to prevent anybody from seeking asylum in 2020, like in those cases, they're dealing with laws that predate modern immigration law. But in the case of this foreign policy provision, it's something that like was instituted or that was created, during the kind of first wave of like anti-immigrant panics in the 20th century after the First World War, and then kind of enshrined with the rest of modern immigration law in laws in the 1940s or 1950s and 1960s. And in that case, it was just like there's a lot of, if you've ever been to an immigration, like a naturalization interview or that kind of thing, like people may be asked, are you a member of the Communist Party? Like it's still accepted to have a lot of anti-communist stuff baked into US law. And, so one of those was this assumption that like, oh, of course we can reject somebody if they're a communist. And actually the provision that they used, 212F, that they've used for the travel bans, a lot of the case law on that was people who like professors who were coming to the United States to give talks, and they were like, can't do it, that person's a communist. And the question of when the government can do that was litigated a little bit, because that's the thing. Law works not by saying the law says this and everybody agrees, but by like, okay, you're using the law to do this. There's disagreement about what that entails. That's when we go to the courts and have judges develop out, here's when this means you can do this, here's when it means you can't. This administration's attitude toward that provision, or toward the foreign policy provision and toward a whole lot of other stuff, is to say, what we say is the law, and how dare you try to go through, the process that we understand is like the rule of law to determine whether that actually applies in this particular case. So like this foreign policy provision, for example, there is, we've had at least one court ruling in the Khalil case that it is with the lower court judge saying, look, I personally think that this is unconstitutional. I can't actually rule that, but like, but there is a question of, is if they're going to use it in this way, and it calls attention to, wow, we've still had this law in the books that sure seems like it's a violation of free speech. It is not impossible that the outcome of this is to say, actually, you can't implement this in a way that is consistent with democratic rights. Whether or not we actually go that direction, it depends on the courts that we have right now. But like, it's absolutely law. Due process is supposed to be something that runs through all of our laws. As Nayna was saying, the way that you tell when the law applies is through due process. And so the administration acting as if they can't be accountable to anything is certainly a problem for that.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the zoom out. I didn't realize that this was happening with other laws as well, but that totally makes sense. I got a question about AIC's report and the link to it. I will share that again in 1 second. It is a really good report. Everyone should definitely read it. I read it before this. Okay. Or someone else will send it because my computer is acting up. Okay. Ama, I was hoping you could talk to us a little bit about the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case, since you mentioned it earlier and since it has gotten a lot of attention. Just, I'm sure folks know, but I'll just give a brief overview. In March, Trump sent about 200 men to El Salvador, deported them without any real due process rights, and sent them to a very notorious prison called CCOT. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was a Maryland resident. CASA represents a lot of folks in Maryland. Trump admitted they deported him in error. A lot has happened since March. I know CASA is very involved in the case. Can you give us a quick update on like where his case stands now? And again, like why his case should be of concern to all Americans, regardless of their citizenship or immigration status?
Of course, happy to talk about that. I could talk about this case for days, but right, very briefly. I think one thing to remember about Kilmer's case that I think, I didn't hear in your summary, Adrienne, was the fact that Kilmer had an immigration court order, withholding of removal court order, right, that explicitly said that he should not and could not be deported to El Salvador, right, which was his home country that he fled because he was being persecuted. The government deported him anyway. And after months of, litigation in court as well as fighting outside of the courtroom, which really was, I think, like one of the biggest examples of like people-powered movements that we've seen this administration thus far, right? The government, succumbed to the pressure, brought him back to the United States, not to essentially like restore him to where he was as ordered by the Supreme Court, but rather to like bring sham criminal charges against him. Very important to remember that throughout, as we were talking about, I think it was Sarah and Nayna maybe who, spoke a little bit about like the propaganda, right, that the government, that the administration has been putting out, right, against like Black and brown people. So much of a smear campaign against Kilmer, right? We have a, former DOJ attorney who was blowing the whistle, right? Put like laying it all out, the different ways that, and frankly, the different lies and like horrible tactics that the administration tried to use to demonize and criminalize Kilmer, right? All the, false allegations that he's an MS-13 member and, like all these things. Long story short, right? Fast forward to today, we got two amazing legal rulings, right? One from the district judge in Nashville, Tennessee, who ruled today, who denied the government's request to keep Kilmer detained during his criminal proceedings. So we got that ruling today. And we also got a ruling from Judge Zinnes in Maryland, who has been hearing the unlawful deportation case, in which she ruled that upon Kilmer's release from criminal custody, ICE should not, cannot, must not detain him, right? But rather, Kilmer should be returned to Maryland and placed in an order of supervision. So we have these two wonderful rulings that came out today, significant victories. Of course, right, we anticipate the government is going to appeal because they have continued to fight tooth and nail in this case, for, whatever, for reasons that shall not be mentioned, right? Because again, we have a white supremacist, xenophobic, right, federal agenda right now. That is, kind of a summary of where things stand with Kilmer's case, right? Again, we just got these two decisions today, so there's a lot of scrambling attorneys are doing, right? And, to be determined exactly when, how, where Kilmer is going to be returned to Maryland. So we are overjoyed by this. It is very concerning though, right? Because again, we have these two wonderful orders that have come out today. We have seen over the last few months in Kilmer's case, the government just blatantly flouting court orders, disregarding court orders, delaying, right, compliance with orders, doing things secretly. So we don't know how they're going to respond to these orders that just were issued today. Again, to be determined. But the fact that we have to say to be determined is so problematic, right? And this is why we should all be concerned because we live in a country where, apparently rule of law is meant to be paramount, right? The Constitution is meant to be paramount. How can we sit here today and say, well, we don't know whether the government is going to comply with the court orders? That's a problem. And this is why we should all be concerned because if this happened to Kilmer, it could happen to me. It could happen to, right? Like as a Black immigrant woman in this country, like this could happen to me. This could happen to any CASA member. This could happen to anyone in our immigrant community, right? And particularly anyone in our Black and brown immigrant community. it is so concerning that we are in a period right now where the government can just kidnap people off of the street and disappear them. I think a report was released recently that of the 200 and something men who were sent to El Salvador, um, there now has it has now been, flagged that there are about 40 more people who were on that flight who are unaccounted for. No one knows where they are, and El Salvador is saying they have no record of them. This is a problem that the government of the United States can abduct people, disappear them, and no one knows where they are, how to find them. It is a slippery slope. And then the other thing that I want to point out, right, is the fact that some of these individuals were literally in asylum process. They had pending asylum applications, other applications for immigration protection that were pending. And again, the government took them, deported them. Venezuelans who are seeking asylum in this country were deported to El Salvador and have now been returned to Venezuela, the same country that they fled because they knew that they would be persecuted or tortured. We should all be terrified. We should all be angry. And what I always say is we need to channel that fear and channel that anger into action and make it clear that this is not normal. This is not okay. And we will not accept it as normal or as okay. And we will fight back, which is what we have been doing in Kilmer's case and in so many other cases nationally.
Thank you.
Adrienne, can I make one quick point to build on what Amma just said? In my previous job at the Southern Poverty Law Center, I represented an American from Philadelphia who was held on an ICE detainer because ICE thought he was a Jamaican immigrant. He was a Black American from Philadelphia. He was living in Key West at the time, Monroe County, Florida, and he was arrested for something else, and he got an ICE ping in the system. The sheriff received a detainer request, which is not mandatory. Counties do not have to comply with detainer requests. They are requests. But this county, despite my client saying multiple times, I'm a US citizen, I'm from Philadelphia, detained him, turned him over to ICE. ICE drove him to Crome Detention Center, a notorious facility in South Florida that is, currently in the news for overcrowding and terrible conditions, and threatened to deport him to Jamaica, a country he's never been to. And as a gay man, he was very afraid of being sent to Jamaica because of stories that he'd heard about persecution of gay men there. And I mean, this happened in the first Trump administration, and he just felt like he was in a total black hole, could not contact anyone, couldn't convince anyone that he was from Philly, not from Jamaica, and suddenly found himself in an ICE detention facility. Again, as Amma said, this can happen to anybody. If they think that you look like the wrong person or your name matches somebody, it can happen to you.
Okay, thank you. That's terrifying. Related to Florida, I was hoping that you could talk to us, Sarah, a little bit more about Alligator Alcatraz, this new detention center that the Trump administration has opened up. We again don't know who's going in. It flooded a few days after, or I think the day after it opened. All the reports that we've gotten out there are that it's pretty terrible conditions for the people who are kept in what looks to be like cages, essentially. I was hoping you could talk a little bit about why this is such a concern, and then also tell me a little bit about what you think about the name Alligator Alcatraz and whether we should be using it, because that is a question that I got in the chat. Should we be using a different name and not the name that Trump really wants us to use?
Sure, I'm happy to start there. No one should use that term. If you want an alliterative phrase, you could call it a gator gulag or a crocodile concentration camp. But Alcatraz was a federal prison for people who'd been convicted of crimes. And no one in this facility has been convicted of any crimes. And in fact, no one knows on what authority they are being held. And that is what is particularly disturbing to me, right? This like concentration camp in the Everglades, where they are sort of using like heat and mosquitoes and the threat of hurricanes and the presence of dangerous wildlife as a deterrent for people to try to get out, is being operated by the Florida Department of Emergency Management. That's not a law enforcement agency. They don't have a 287G agreement, which is an agreement with the federal government that allows certain local law enforcement agencies to perform specific immigration functions in specific contexts. So they have no federal, they haven't been deputized by the federal government to do immigration detention. They don't have any other sort of agreement with the federal government to do immigration detention. So this is just a federal, or this is just a Florida state agency, like the Florida, I don't know, Driver's Services Department. Like, it's like the DMV is holding people in a tent camp with subpar conditions and the threat of like mosquito-borne illness and terrible treatment. And what authorizes them to do that? Who is taking people to this facility is, we've heard that sometimes ICE is taking people to the facility to do what? Hand them over to the Florida Department of Emergency Management? That makes no sense. Like, again, the government, any government needs authority to hold someone, to seize them and hold them and detain them. Like, that's just a core principle that applies in civil detention and in criminal detention. There must be authority to hold someone and take them out of their life and keep them in a cage. And I have no idea what the authority is here. Because I don't think that the Florida Department of Emergency Management seems to have no authority from the federal government to do immigration detention. They actually answered a request for, like, an open records request yesterday, saying that they have no responsive records when asked for any sort of intergovernmental service agreement, any sort of 287G agreement, any agreement with the federal government to do this. So what are they doing? Are they just freelancing? Are they just kidnapping people and holding them in a black site? I mean, this is a real important legal question. And Florida is often where the federal government goes to beta test its very, very bad ideas on immigration, right? They invented basic ordering agreements, which aren't even relevant anymore, so there's no need to think about them. Warrant service officer agreements, which are like a sub form of 287G. They've massively expanded 287G in the state. And obviously the governor is extremely gung-ho to turn Florida into, a site of immigration innovation for sort of bad policy. I think Florida and Texas are generally competing in that realm. But this appears to be a completely extra legal state immigration detention site, which, that's a black site, right? You can't just hold people. And so this to me brings up the idea of what happened in El Salvador, or what's happening at Guantanamo. I don't understand the legal basis to hold non-citizens at Guantanamo either. In El Salvador, Democracy Forward filed a lawsuit regarding the El Salvador agreement, alleging again, not only that it broke various laws and treaties, but that it was completely without legal authority, right? The men sent to El Salvador were not technically deported because most of them didn't have orders of removal. And if they did, they weren't like being removed to El Salvador for indefinite detention in prison. That would be extradition, and it wasn't an extradition. They weren't being held in criminal custody, and they weren't being deported. So what was happening? That's why a lot of people use the word rendition or kidnapping when talking about what happened to those men, because it wasn't deportation. And here, this isn't an arrest. This isn't a criminal arrest. What's happening in Florida, there seems to be no authority to arrest people for civil immigration violations because people are in there without ever having been charged with removability or anything else. So it really is a very scary sort of innovation in federal state cooperation on just sort of sucking people off the streets and putting them into some kind of facility that has no legal authorization. And with the massive amounts of funding in this new budget for immigration detention, there's certainly a concern that this model will proliferate. It's already been challenged in a couple of lawsuits, one regarding environmental law and another regarding access to counsel and some other issues. So perhaps, legal action in the courts can throw some sand in the gears or shut this model down, but it is extremely concerning as an innovation from Ron DeSantis and then the Florida government.
Thanks. Yeah, those are the last people I want in charge of this. I want to go back a little bit to something Dara mentioned earlier on, which is oh, sorry, Nayna, did you want to add anything? No? Okay. I wanted to rewind a little bit to temporary protected status, and a lot of people losing their right pretty much overnight to legally work and live in this country. I know a lot of these cases are still tied up in court, but maybe Dara, if you could expand, Dara and Ama, if you could both expand a little bit, what happens next if Trump is successful with removing TPS for more than 500,000 people? And what problems come with revoking the legal status essentially overnight of so many people at once in this country?
So this is a really good example of something that like is it could be hypothetically legal to do this. The way in which they're doing it is almost certainly not, but also like there's a gap here between the way the law works and what's necessary for people to like plan their lives and thrive in their communities. Because temporary protected status it's called, like, there's a term called twilight status, which is, you have some protection, but like it's not indefinite. It's not like having a green card. And it's not really like having a formal visa either. It's like at the discretion of the executive every, 2 years or every 18 months it basically, like, they specify whether it will exist for a given country and for how long. And so we have cases where, in the case of people from, say, El Salvador, that's been 25 plus years of them living in 18-month to 2-year increments. And that's like, they've managed to really build communities for themselves, to make families here, to make lives for themselves. But it's with the knowledge that hypothetically, all of that could go away. And for a while, that seemed a little bit academic, like, oh, no, presidents were just kind of like, every time it came up, it was getting extended. And then under the first Trump administration, they had this policy of, in general, they were trying to sunset these, and there was litigation that got held up. But this time around, they've made it clear that they want to, basically kill the program entirely. And so we're in a situation where people who, by definition, if they had another way to if they had a path to more permanent legal status, like, they would have taken it already, right? These are people who have been here for ages and ages and have never had a way to get legal, have never had a path to citizenship, and now are, losing what claim to be here they have. The line from this administration is always, well, when your legal status expires, you should just leave the country. You should just self-deport. You should register yourself on the CBP home app and tell us you're going home, and then you should go home. And like, when we're talking about people who have been here for literally over a quarter of a century, that is not practically what the choice is. Yes, that's an option, but in practice, the choice is often to just stay in the US and try to stay under the radar, even though, the government has people's records, and there's a very real concern about using people's information for, sending ICE to places where it knows people live, and having people penalized essentially for having followed US law for decades.
Yeah, I mean, right, so second everything that you just said, right? But really coming back to the point of like, the government is trying to widen the pool of people who are detainable and deportable, right? So you have individuals who have been here with lawful status, and then all of a sudden you strip them of that status. You have now made them, right? If you have now put them in a category of people who can be detained and deported. And then also taking away the possibility, I completely agree that for a lot of individuals, there is no pathway to like long-term lawful status. But even for those who that might exist, the government is taking that opportunity away from them, right? Folks who are in immigration proceedings and seeking asylum, the government is dismissing their proceedings, right? The government is putting all these roadblocks in place for them to seek additional, like long-term status. And then the government is stripping funding from those entities, from those agencies, those organizations, those legal service providers who could help these individuals secure that long-term status, right? So it's a combination of so many things, like a very well coordinated combination of things to make sure that you are making people deportable and then taking away any possibility that they have of coming out of that category of being deportable. So that and like, and not just, we've seen like they're stripping funding from legal service providers, and they're also trying to criminalize us, legal service providers. They're targeting us, investigating us, smearing our names, right? All sorts of things. Again, just like a very well coordinated attempt to make sure that they can widen the pool of Black and brown people who they can kick out of this country. Um, and it's very, very disturbing, right? Because for a lot of individuals on TPS, they have no home to go back to, right? Like, how can you tell someone whose country is in the middle of a civil war, right? And say, yeah, no, you need to pack your bags and go because your TPS has ended. I should go back to death? How is that possible, right? And so you have individuals who are just going to remain here and then now are, again, as you said, ICE knows where they are, right? So ICE can just come knocking on their door, especially now that they've gotten all this new funding, right? So anyway, very kind of well coordinated combination that they are running right now as they strip people of whatever protections that they had.
Yeah, I always found it a little crazy that they thought everyone would magically self-deport. But I guess we'll see how this turns out. Nayna and Amma again, I was hoping you both could talk a little bit about Trump's budget that recently passed. Obviously, it gives a lot more money to DHS and to ICE enforcement, specifically billions more dollars. What are your concerns with the expanded budget? And what do you foresee changing in immigration enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think what we are lined up to see is an unprecedented ramping up of immigration enforcement. And I really don't think Americans are ready for what we're about to see. This is a bill where we've created a detention and deportation machine with a footprint comparable to the defense budgets of entire countries like Poland, Israel, and France. The scale of what Congress has now funded makes this an enforcement regime that essentially rivals military grade spending, but for enforcement in the interior of our country. It includes 45 billion, as I think Sarah alluded to, for immigration detention. That's an over 300% increase in what ICE has right now in its most recent annual detention budget. That is money that will primarily benefit the private prison companies that run immigration detention facilities. And that's funding that we've calculated would likely increase detention to somewhere between 125 to 150,000 beds or more. And that is comparable to the current population of the entire federal prison system. The bill also gives 29.9 billion to ICE's enforcement and deportation operations, which includes funding an additional hiring an additional 10,000 ICE officers over 5 years. So by spring of 2026, we're looking at a projected 30,000 removals possible each month, right? Right now, we've heard the administration threaten 1 million removals in a year. We have daily arrest goals of 3,000. They haven't had the infrastructure to meet their own goals. This provides that infrastructure and more. And when we see those arrests and those removals, we will quite obviously be talking about newly arrived migrants, workers, families, people with more than a decade of residence in the United States. We know that there are already, 50% of people in detention right now before this funding has pushed through have no criminality at all. These are folks who are in violation of civil immigration law. We know that in just June, there's been 40% of arrests have been of people with absolutely no criminal background. So we can only expect that to get worse. What we've seen in places like LA, we can expect to see in cities all around the country, blue cities that the administration is targeting, but also other cities where they're working hand in hand with state and local police. And the last thing, I'll just add about this bill is, as Americans start to wake up to this reality of a supercharged deportation machine, they will also be losing healthcare coverage. They will also see hospitals in their communities, especially if they live in rural parts of our country, shutting down. And that trade-off that came with this bill, where we see the federal government, Congress, and Trump signing off on all of this money to immigration enforcement at the expense of core American programs, will certainly hurt immigrants, but absolutely will hurt everyday Americans. And those two pieces, I think, will go hand in hand. And what we're looking at 3 years from now will, I think, be quite different than what we've seen in 6 months, unless we're able to scale back the funding that's been provided here in this bill.
Does anyone have anything else to add on ICE's enforcement, or should I go to the happy question?
Happy question.
Okay. I'd love to end it on, I know a lot of bad things are happening, but I'd love to end it on like at least a small kernel of hope. Give us some like solutions that you see, so like maybe a happy story you've seen recently in terms of a victory in the immigration space, or any ideas you have for like how citizens can be protecting their immigrant neighbors. Any of the above, I will take. Does anyone want to kick us off?
Sure. I mean, like, I think that the best news is that, consistent with a pattern that we've generally seen in public opinion, which is that whichever way the public thinks the president runs on immigration, they swing the opposite direction. So, we saw an increase in anti-immigrant sentiment under Biden, and we're now seeing a swing back to pro-immigrant sentiment under Donald Trump. But like, even more than that, this is now an issue where the majority of Americans, and a pretty substantial majority, don't like what's happening. They're telling pollsters that. And, after years and years and years, when we were told that like immigration is Trump's signature issue, which it's the strongest issue, it's the thing you shouldn't attack him on, the fact that it now looks like the rest of closer to the rest of his approval ratings indicates that, some of this really is getting through to people, that that even people who don't usually pay an enormous amount of attention and who don't live in parts of the country where this is really like being shoved in their faces are seeing and feel that something is wrong here. And I think that what's really, what's particularly helping with that are, it's something that I say a lot, is that a lot of the immigration debate, kind of for people who don't follow it very closely, it's about powerful images. And when you have like, when you see images of like tons of people trying to come in, a lot of people freak out about that. We're not just seeing the images of people, protesters getting like tear gassed in the streets of LA by the National Guard, and, of people being just roughed up and arrested while their loved ones take cell phone videos, but also like the image of Mahmoud Khalil's first press conference after he got out. He was, like they were making sure that he was out there and speaking and representing and being fearless in a way that you could, and then they released a picture of him holding his newborn son. Like, it's very obvious just through the visuals that what is happening to people who are part of our communities, who are part of our lives. And I think that message is really getting through.
I agree. That has been the bright light for me throughout this period, that public opinion on immigration is really turning as they see the Trump-Miller vision enacted, both in in people's communities and maybe on TV or online, if it's not actually happening in a particular community yet. I think Trump and Miller really overestimated the appetite for cruelty and sadism in the American public when it comes to immigration. And they sold this campaign as getting out a bunch of like criminals and rapists and gang members, and people realize that actually it's like a lady who works at the local restaurant and the dad that from like pickup at school, and just people in the community. So there's a real mismatch between the way they sold this during the campaign and how it is being enforced and sort of carried out, and people are reacting to that. So that is absolutely a bright light right now.
I agree with both of those, right? And I think, a lot of times people feel powerless, right? And I want to say, like, do not underestimate the impact of people power, the power of the people, right? And so, right, like when you see those images, share them, right? If there's a rally happening nearby, go, show up. The first court hearing that we had for Kilmer, the judge, I mean, we packed that courtroom and we packed outside that courtroom. And the judge looked out and said, like, I can see that this issue is very important to the community. So I will make sure to move as quickly as I can, right? Just like showing up. People will say, like, I don't have money to donate. Your time is everything. Showing up is everything. I've been so inspired within Maryland, and especially some like localities within Maryland, where folks have like organized themselves into like rapid response groups, right? They have signal chats, like they are monitoring ICE activity. They are going to different like high risk neighborhoods and doing KYR canvassing, right? Making sure that folks know what their rights are. I think just really like shedding light on the administration's actions, showing up, um, and being like accomplices and co-conspirators in justice, right? And for those who do have money to donate, I think it's important to do so, right? There are, again, entities, organizations, or agencies that are trying to do this work are facing so much backlash. We're having our funding stripped. But like the fight continues, right? And so being able to support that fight through whatever means that you can, whether it's money, time, presence, that is huge. And I'm seeing that happen, and that just gives me so much light. That gives me so much motivation, so much energy to keep the fight going. So thank you to everyone, right, who's already doing all that. And thank you in advance to everyone who will do that as we fight this, like, as we fight back during this like very, very crazy time.
Sorry, Nayna, I'll let you speak. That judge story is so good though. I loved it. And also I just want to say, as someone who's publishing stories on these, like people showing up to protest, those photos that people like I get to use instead of just Trump's face over and over again, like I appreciate it. Nayna, go ahead. Sorry, tell me your
Yeah. I mean, no, I think it's like we've already described so many powerful images here, and Emma's talking about what she's seeing in Maryland. And for me, what has been a real kernel of hope is, seeing not just solidarity, but speaking out in communities that supported Trump in his election. Folks who are seeing, this restaurant owner in my community has been taken away. Let me get out there with a poster and say, bring her home. My kid's teammate who's a soccer star is sitting in detention. Let's all make t-shirts and wear those together. That kind of signaling from constituencies that have traditionally been harder to reach, for me is a kernel of hope. And I'll just say, to echo the call of don't be afraid to speak out. I mean, our generation in this country, like we haven't had to fight for democracy in this way, right? It may not be intuitive. It may feel ineffective to go to a protest or to wear a t-shirt like that. But what we have seen at the council, I think in real time, is that when that noise gets bigger, especially in some of these sort of purple or more moderate political districts, members of Congress start feeling more comfortable and having political cover to push back more, to support pro-immigrant policies. When the noise gets louder, federal judges on the margins are a little bit more willing to hold the line, right? So that public noise matters a lot, even when we don't feel its impact immediately. And for me, seeing that response and reaction already in 6 months gives me hope. And I think the really just hard question for us is, you know, how do we then take that and leverage it and build something new, if and when we get out of this, that's sustainable for America and immigrants and democracy. That's, you know, that will be the hard work, that I think lies ahead, but I'm hopeful that we can do that.
Thank you. This was such a good note to end on. I appreciate all of you joining us. Again, please read AIC's report. Please follow CASA, follow Democracy Forward, and join TNR's next event. It'll be a good one. Thank you to everyone.